I would like to give a brief background to this lecture series. Since 2018, the University of Bonn pools expertise in sustainability research across faculties in the transdisciplinary research area, innovation and technology for sustainable futures. The TRA organizes the lecture series Innovation Pathways to Sustainability as a forum for high-profile and international visible scientists who are active in academia or at the science policy interface. We ask speakers to address research opportunities to enhance sustainability in all its dimensions: social, environmental, and economic. Speakers are invited to present cutting-edge research in their fields of expertise and discuss related future research agenda with the audience. For today's lecture, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Ray Huffaker from the University of Florida. It's a really great pleasure to welcome you here, Ray. Ray is an economist and a true interdisciplinary scholar. He received his degrees in environmental economics and law at UC Davis and works today in the Ecosystem Complexity Group in the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering at the University of Florida. His research specialty is to reconstruct the dynamics of real-world and experimental systems from observational data, map out and measure dynamic causal world system dynamics from observed data with neural networks and machine learning. His research addresses sustainability issues in a wide-ranging application, including renewable energy production, saltwater intrusions, water treatments in nodal wetlands, watershed hydrology, and not least in food security, something also at the heart of TRA 6. He has collaborated in research projects with colleagues in engineering, economics, physics at universities throughout the European Union and the United States, conducted PhD workshops on empirical dynamic modeling in various countries, and co-authored a book on nonlinear time series published in Oxford University Press. His presentation today is on reconstructing resilience of real-world economic, hydrological, and biophysical systems to extreme climate events from observational data. Ray, after I give the word to you, I just want to inform the audience that my colleague Jan Berner, one of the speakers of TRA 6, will lead the question and answer part after your presentation. And now, welcome again, Ray, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Hartman. I'm honored to speak at your seminar series. I always love coming back to Bonn. I've had so many excellent collaborations with your students and your faculty, and has definitely added to my productivity. Starting back at Washington State University, when I worked with the first graduate student from Bonn that I met, Professor Heckelei, followed by many others. They were the best students we had in the department. There's something happening at Bonn that is turning out very good people and very good work. Today, I want to speak to you about resilience analysis. Resilience analysis is being increasingly applied across multiple disciplines to analyze the response of dynamic systems to catastrophic environmental and climatic events that are occurring with unprecedented frequency. In order to incorporate resilience into my own work, I had to do an extensive literature review where I was confronted with many questions and many challenges. And that's what I want to share with you today, in the hope that if you incorporate resilience analysis into your research, this may be of help. The papers that I read in resilience analysis start off with the main definition that reads like this. Resilience is the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten system function, viability, or development. There's a lot of information in that, so let's unpack it. The capacity of a dynamic system to adapt. To do resistance analysis, you need to know the dynamics of the system that you're working with. To adapt successfully, you need to know the dynamics because we need to know the response of these systems to catastrophic events. Successfully, that's a normative term. There is a lot of judgment as to what is successful adaptation of a system. And so there's disagreement as to whether successful adaptation means the system returns to the function it had or it transforms to something better. And who's to say what's better? That threaten system function. Okay, these are disturbances that threaten system function. Disturbance implies an outside shock that is disturbing what the system normally does. A shock so great that it's disturbing function. That means we're talking about extreme shocks. When you're trying to learn how people do resistance analysis, you start off with dynamics. All these papers start off with a conception of what the dynamics are of the system they're studying. There are three that I found in the literature. One is called a restoration resilience conceptualization, or they call it framing. And this is the graph on the left part of the screen. It assumes that systems self-adjust back to equilibrium. So this plot you see, it has a variable on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. And no matter where you start in this system, which is denoted by x sub 0, you go to an equilibrium, which is denoted x star. That's a very nice property to have with the system. It means that the system self-adjusts. There is no need for human in-the-loop management. The second conceptualization or framing that I found in the literature is called transformation. The system transforms from one dynamic behavior to another. So the example you find of this in the literature is you have now two equilibria in the system, and there's a boundary. And so in this middle graph, you see a boundary, capital B sub 1. Above the boundary, initial conditions go to the equilibrium denoted in red. Below the initial conditions, below that threshold level, go to a lower level equilibrium. And after a shock, it could be that that boundary shifts so that an initial condition that once went to one equilibrium goes to the next. But it could be more general, where after a shock, the entire dynamic behavior changes to an alternative framing, for instance, a restoration framing. The third conceptualization that I found in the literature, this is the one on the far right of the slide, is a complexity framing. This is a network, a very complex network of nonlinear actions among many variables, high dimensional. And what is interesting about complex systems is they have the potential for self-organization. What that means is as they evolve, you can see emergent nonlinear dynamics that are very different from the behavior of each individual alone. So the system somehow adds something and gives you some very complex, interesting behavior. The type of complexity that's recognized in the resilience literature is high dimensional. That means these dynamics, if you want to study the coevolution of all the covariates together, you need to know each one of them. And that I represent right here by this matrix. This is called state space in dynamics. The columns that you see are all variables, x1, x2, x3, x4. So in a watershed, this could be the stream discharge, which is the amount of flow. It could be temperature, precipitation. To study high dimensional systems, we use complex networks, and that is this figure right here, where you use dynamic systems modeling and you have all the interactions among all the variables. One type of dynamic I did not find in the literature is a emergent low dimensional nonlinear dynamic. Dimension reduction is a gift to modelers. It means that you can study the dynamics of a system, not from the entire dimension of the system, studying all the variables, which is tough because it's hard to know what all the variables are, and it's tough to have data on all of them. But with low dimensional dynamics, it means that as this system evolves, it evolves into a subset of state space. So you can study it in a lot fewer dimensions with a lot fewer variables. What happens is that the system does not evolve to a single equilibrium, as we have in the leftward slide, but all initial conditions in the system evolve or are attracted toward a geometric form along which they cycle forever without ever escaping. And I have a short video example. So what you're going to see in this all the stars, the light forms you see are initial conditions scattered over every starting point. And they're going to be attracted to this geometric form along which they're going to cycle forever. That is another dynamic, nonlinear dynamic that I study. So you can see the initial points being attracted to this attractor, and now they evolve along it, along trajectories forever. This is called a strange attractor because, again, no matter where a point starts, it is attracted to this figure and then it's captured. It stays there forever and it oscillates irregularly. So not regularly along a sine wave, but irregularly. So if you have the numbers to that trajectory, you have a time series that's extremely volatile. Now, the interesting thing about these systems, it's the internal interactions that are causing this volatility. Endogenous, it is not an exogenous shock that is causing volatility, because if you see this rightward diagram, that system, once it gets to equilibrium, it's flat. It flatlines. So the only way you can get volatility out of that system is shock it from the outside. And then as it adjusts, it creates volatility that you actually see in data. So here was my job in my sabbatical in Spain earlier this year. Spain has set up a number of experimental watersheds 2 decades ago, and they instrumented them to compile a rich data set on a number of watershed variables, including stream discharge, sediment concentration, sediment load, turbidity, precipitation, temperature, and then some climate variables that I'll talk about later that are in the blue. Now, my job was to take these data and inform the government about the resilience of this watershed system to extreme climatic shocks. I really didn't know much about resilience, which is why I engaged in a literature review. And so I was looking for direction of how I could look at these data, which, as you can see, are highly volatile. You look at them and you can't see easy patterns. How could I go from here and talk about the resilience of this system to extreme climatic events? And so that's the journey that I'm taking you on with me in this talk. And the first thing that I noticed is any of these framings could generate this type of volatility. As I already mentioned, the restoration framing could generate this type of volatility if it's shocked. And that's the definition of resilience, is that the system is being shocked, but it's being shocked externally. So if I assumed that all this volatility is externally generated, then I could use a restoration framing, which is a linear stochastic dynamic. That's where you have a linear system that behaves normally, except it's shocked. It goes erratic until it adjusts back to equilibrium. But this volatility is also compatible with a transformation framing, where the system is changing from one dynamic to another in response to an external shock. And in this case, I would look for critical change points in these data, which represent abrupt shifts in behavior. And there are statistical tools to do that. So that's another way I could have approached it. A third way is emergent nonlinear dynamics, this attractor that you see. If I find that, then the complexity is being generated endogenously. Now, you could say, well, just choose one, Ray, but the management implications are very different. If I choose a linear stochastic, I'm telling the Spanish government, if catastrophic events happen, just wait them out, because the system will adjust back to normal, laissez-faire. If I tell them in its emergent dynamic, where all of this volatility is being created internally, then I'm saying there's need for human in the loop management. You have to do something if you want to mitigate the effects. So I have to be right in what I'm telling them the cause is and what the system response is going to be. So I looked for direction in the literature. How do I choose among these three different conceptualizations? What I found was that there was no guidance. Investigators do not start with data and then attempt to backward or reverse engineer the resilience properties that went into generating that data. The literature is model first. So it's pick one of these conceptualizations and then run with it. Well, the review studies I read of the resilience work that has gone on criticizes this approach. So these aren't my criticisms. I might share them, but no, they're the ones that I read about in review papers. And a major review paper said that these conceptualizations are presumed at the beginning of a study, and they are not adequately conceptualized or tested. The Journal of Hydrology had a special issue dedicated to resilience work. And the editors, after a lit review of these studies in hydrology, concluded that they did not capture the essential socio-hydrological dynamics that we see in the real world. So we have a gap between the conceptualization and the real world that managers have to respect when they're managing real world systems. So the question I had was, okay, why? Why are we doing this kind of science where we adopt the model without adequate testing? And the literature that came closest to explaining it is medical diagnosis literature. they have cognitive biases that are misuse or non-use of evidence. So it's like a doctor, and you go with the respiratory system, and the doctor always diagnoses it as a cold, which is okay if you have a cold, but not very helpful if you have something more chronic. The best way to represent or to illustrate this cognitive bias is with this famous painting, The Pipe by René Magritte. And it's a painting of a pipe, and the caption underneath says, "This is not a pipe." And he got a lot of criticism for that, because you look at it and you say, of course it's a pipe. And Magritte responded, it's just a representation, is it not? Try to pack it, try to smoke it. You can't. Now, if we as modelers were to make a similar illustration, we'd put our model there and we'd have underneath, this is not the real world. And when I make this point to my colleagues, they say, well, of course not. Models are abstractions. Well, we know that. And George Box, a famous statistician, he recognized this when he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we know their models are wrong. It's a question of what makes them useful. This was a question that was entertained by the United States Congress in 2009, right after the financial crisis. The macroeconomic model they had been using was a linear stochastic model that allowed the macroeconomy to adjust to outside shocks. So, two problems. One is that Congress was told, leave the market alone. It will self-correct to the financial crisis. The second problem was, given that all the shocks were coming from the outside, this model failed to predict the endogenous, systematic reasons why the crisis developed. The housing bubble, for one, mortgages that couldn't be paid off, for another. Congress was very, we'd have to say, angry, because they said, you gave us a model, it caught us unawares, the financial crisis caught us unawares, we were unable to respond to it. So they called in the economists responsible for the models, they called in economists to critique the efforts, and they asked the economists, why did you give us a model like this? And one of the economists responded with this cartoon, which is an illustration of what is called anchoring bias. An anchor keeps a boat in place. An anchor keeps economists and others using the same model they've always used because they're comfortable with it. So here's the comic. You have the person looking for his keys underneath the street lamp. And he says, I'm looking for my quarter I dropped, well, quarter or house key, whatever. And the policeman says, did you drop it here? And the person responds, no, I dropped it 2 blocks down the street. And the policeman says, well, then why are you looking here? And he says, this is because it's where the light is. So you're not modeling for where the quarter actually is, you're modeling where the light is, you're anchored to the lamppost, which is non-productive. So how can modelers avoid anchoring bias, contributing models that aren't of use to policymakers? Well, there was a seminal paper in Science magazine in 1994, Oreskes et al. And it was entitled Model Validation. And it was more how not to do it rather than how to do it. But they said, if your model is going to be useful to policymakers, so if you make this conceptualization and you expect policymakers to use it, you have the duty to make sure that it corresponds to the real world system that the policymakers are attempting to regulate. That is your burden of proof. So then the question is, how do we do that? So you can see it. As I go through this analysis, I keep coming up with more and more questions. And now we're at the one, okay, well, how do we validate a model? Go further into the Oreskes article, and you're finding out how not to do it. One of the conventional ways that we validate a model is we fit the model to data. We look at the goodness of fit statistic, typically an R-squared statistic, and if it's high, we figure that validates the model. Often you see articles that run several different models and compare the R-squareds and pick the model with the highest R-squared. Oreskes said, no, this is not valid. This commits a logical fallacy. The logical fallacy is called affirming the consequence, and the logical structure is if A, then B. The fallacy is trying to reverse that. If B, then A. So a simple example would be, it rains, therefore I take my umbrella. I take my umbrella, therefore it's raining. Well, in Florida, we take our umbrella in the summer just to keep the sun off. It ignores other alternatives is the problem. So in the context of modeling, an excellent model gives a high R-squared. My model gave a high R-squared, therefore it's an excellent model. No, because we know that several other models could be parameterized to give a high R-squared fit. There was an excellent paper in American Statistician where this point was made very simply. You have 4 graphs there. On the horizontal axis, you have variable y, and on the vertical axis, variable y, horizontal axis, variable x. And you have 4 very different relationships. And what this statistician's point was is I fit the same line with the same R-squared to all 4. It doesn't distinguish among a random scattering of points, a nonlinear a model. R-squared, it's not meant to do this job, so we shouldn't use it that way. So that's a way not to validate the model. So here was my solution. I didn't get guidance on how to go from data to what the resilient structure should be, so I had to make up my own, which is actually a nice research project to have. You can attempt to be innovative. So what I put together here that you see before you is a diagnostic workflow. It begins right here with ground zero observation of time series records, like I got in Spain. And then it directs the investigator through a sequence of testable hypotheses on those data that point the way to a resilience framing and subsequent analysis representing the most meaningful reality. That's my objective. So there's a lot of information in here, but I'll walk you through it very quickly. You start with observing time series records. The first thing that I do with them is signal processing. Resilience is a systematic response. Noise obscures that. So I use signal processing to isolate the noise from the structural part of the data. The structural part is what contains the oscillations in the data, the trends in the data, all the structural variation. The noise right here is the unstructured variation that we can model probabilistically. And one nice way to model it is with extreme value statistics, because there's valuable information there. It shows the extreme events that happen randomly. And extreme value statistics can generate a very useful diagnostic called return level plots, which give you the expected waiting time to observe extreme events of certain magnitudes that are occurring randomly. But the structured variation that I isolate in the data, this is where I conduct a sequence of testing hypotheses. And the first hypothesis I test is, are there critical breakpoints in the data? If there are, that indicates that I have a resilience, the resilience framing it indicates is a transformation. That means I have to segment the data by critical breakpoint, and I have to look at what kind of dynamic response I have in each segment. That's a big job. If I don't find critical breakpoints in the data, it means I'm not finding a transformation in response to external or internal shocks, which means I can analyze the time series as a whole. The next hypothesis I test, hypothesis 2, is system dynamics are nonlinear deterministic. In other words, I have a complex system. That is the engine of analysis for this framework, because what nonlinear time series analysis allows me to do is reconstruct the dynamics of the system from the data, backward engineer the dynamics from the data. And once I know the system dynamics, I know what was generating them. Was it a linear stochastic system where you have regular behavior shock from the outside? Was it an endogenously unstable system where you have internal stressors acting from the inside? This allows me to do that. And so I've solved my quandary at the start as to which framing is causing the volatility that I'm seeing in the data. So if I reject nonlinear dynamics, then I have a resilience framing that is the linear stochastic. This is a restoration framing, so volatility that disturbs the normal behavior of a system. And I'm telling the manager, wait it out. The system will self-correct. But I've done it, not by presuming that's the way it was at the start, but by testing the data so that I can give them good, solid statistical evidence that that's the way it is. If I find nonlinear deterministic dynamics in the data, then I have two options. One is that the dynamics are high dimensional. I need, if I want to study the coevolution of the variables in the system, I need to work with every variable. This is done with a dynamic systems approach, the big web type analysis. But if I find low dimensional dynamics where the system evolves in a subset of phase space along a low dimensional attractor, then there are some recently emerging techniques that I can apply to evaluate the interaction among covariates in the system. And I can use those interactions to determine system response, which is the resilience issue. Here, it's response to other variables in the system. So internal stressors, not coming from the outside, but in this resilience framing, a low dimensional complexity framing, it would mean that if I include weather in the system, weather is not an outside force. Weather is an inside variable that causes response in the local variables I'm interested in this case, watershed variables. So I'd like to give you an example of why it's important not to presume linear dynamics when the system and the data are nonlinear. And I want to work off of a study by Lemus Canovas, who used a linear logistic regression model to predict compound extreme values in temperature and precipitation in response to climate shocks. And climate shocks represented by the Mediterranean Oscillation Index. When you do time series work and you're looking at climatic response to climate, don't use big climate models to generate the data. Instead, we use indices of climate teleconnections. El Nino is the most famous one. El Nino is an index of sea surface temperatures that then are climate generators. So they cause atmospheric circulation patterns that then control local weather conditions, or at least are thought to. The Mediterranean Oscillation Index is one that operates over the Iberian Peninsula. And so it is hypothesized. You see the plot of it. When it's in its positive phase, that's the red area, it is hypothesized to create dry, warm conditions on the Iberian Peninsula. When it's in its negative phase, that's the blue area, wet, cold conditions. So that's a hypothesis, and that was tested in this paper. And the first thing you do, and that this person did, to get a relationship between this climatic teleconnection, MOI, which is on the horizontal axis, and P, precipitation, is do a scatter plot. So you have the data of both variables, scatter plot them, and see what relationship develops. This person fit a linear model. So there's a line. It's downward sloping, showing that when the oscillation index is in its positive phase, precipitation is low. Well, that's consistent with the dry hypothesis. And when the MOI is in its negative phase, precipitation is high, which is compatible with the wet in that blue area. The R squared is low, which means that relationship is weak. But there is more information to be had here. If you look at those scatter points, you notice first a problem with heteroscedasticity, which is that the dispersion of these points around that red line is large, and then it decreases. In a good linear model, that band stays the same, the dispersion stays the same. Because of this problem, you have high standard errors, very low precision to this regression line. The second thing you notice is that those dispersion points are not necessarily randomly dispersed. May not be independent. That's another key assumption of linear regression. If you do not have random dispersion of errors along the regression line, then you have a biased, inconsistent estimator, and you have a statistical model that you would never want to take to the government. Low precision, biased, inconsistent. So even though that line gives the right information about MOI and its relationship with precipitation, is generated by a model that we would never present to a government agency. So how do I know those points are not randomly dispersed? Well, first, take a look at that figure. That is a possible attractor. And it has two arms to it. It's kind of shaped like a shoe. And the upper arm, you see, is visited in early winter months. What does the 1, 2, 3, 4 mean? Well, this is time series data. It's monthly, and it goes across 20 years. So I labeled these points by their month. January is 1, February is 2, etc. So you can see that the upper portion of this possible attractor, it's visited by MOI and P during the winter months. And the lower part of this figure to the lower right is visited in the summer and early fall months. And when you draw a line, connect all these dots, what you see is cyclical type behavior, serial correlation. So if you just fit the regression line without taking a look at the interrelationships of those spots, you'd miss potential nonlinear dynamics in these data, and you would be presenting again a linear model without any desirable properties. The graph on the right does the same scatter plot between MOI and temperature, and it has the same problems statistically. But what you see from the scatter plots is a confirmation of the hypothesis that when this global teleconnection, MOI is in a negative phase, precipitation, you have wet, and the temperatures are cold during the winter. And when the MOI is in a positive phase, you have dry, warm conditions. So that hypothesis is confirmed, but we needed to do it reliably by going far deeper than just the linear model. We needed to look for the nonlinear dynamics. So how does it work? I have data, I'm looking for these nonlinear attractors that I saw the hint of in these scatter plots. I want to show you real quickly how it works in case you're interested in doing this type of work yourself. We typically solve the forward problem. We have the model. Those are the equations on the left, and we solve the model to get the solution variables. And in this case, the model in the example, it's the Lorentz atmospheric convection model. Very simple model, 3 variables, X, Y, and Z, a couple of nonlinear interactions. And when it's parameterized, the parameters are omega, rho, and beta. When it's parameterized with these numbers, you get very complex solutions from this very simple nonlinear model. Lorentz took a look at those solutions, could see no visual patterns in those data, but he knew nonlinear dynamics. So what he did was plot these solutions in state space. So the coordinates of state space, that is the plot on the right, are X, Y, and Z, the 3 Lorentz variables. And the points in phase space are that at each point in time, you plot Z against Y against X. Right there is your first point. As time goes on, you keep scatter plotting these points, and you can see the system evolve, and it evolves along the butterfly, the famous butterfly attractor. This is the figure I showed you before, where the initial conditions are attracted to it, and then they oscillate along it forever. When you start with data, we don't have the model. We have maybe data on one variable. Let's say X. That's the time series in red there. So we solve the reverse problem. We reverse engineer the state space dynamics using only one variable, using a technique called time delay embedding. The way we do this mechanically is we create what's called an embedded data matrix. The first column right there, those are our data. In this case, the numbers that are plotted in this X solution. The next columns are forward delayed copies of these data. So the data forwarded, in this case, 6 periods and then 12 periods. Then we scatter plot the rows of this. And when you do that, you have recreated the butterfly attractor from one variable without knowing the equations, which is pretty spectacular and of interest to me because I always start with data. So if I can reconstruct the system dynamics, and what are system dynamics? It's the coevolution of all the variables in the system. But here I only have one. So how did I get a system dynamic out of that? It's because these forwarded copies of my data act as surrogates for the missing variables y and z that I did not observe. How can they do that? Because even though y and z are not present, they are interacting with x. And those interactions I can draw out with these forward lag copies, so that when I re-embed the dynamics in this delayed copy phase space, I get all the properties under a condition. And this condition is called Taken's theorem. And it says that this reconstructed attractor is a one-to-one mapping of points to the original attractor, which if I start with data, it's the real world attractor that I don't see. It's a one-to-one mapping of points to that, so it preserves all the important dynamic properties if the dimension of this matrix, so the column dimension, is large enough to embed the real world attractor. In this case, it was generated with 3 dimensions. I know because I generated the model with 3 equations. So taking the data with 2 lag copies, I know would be enough to embed the original attractor. And so that guarantees me that this reconstruction is going to correspond to the real world. That answers Orescus's question, or Orescus's duty that he put on, that they put on science, that if you have a model, show real world correspondence. Well, here, this is how can show real world correspondence. Okay, so I took the watershed data through that big empirical workflow that I showed you, testing all the hypotheses. This is the result, one of the results that I got. This is an attractor that I reconstructed from the precipitation data, the temperature data, and the MOI climatic teleconnection, which is the internal climatic stressor in my model. In the previous slide, I reconstructed dynamics from lag copies of a single variable, but Taken's theorem has been generalized such that I can use any group of the variables to reconstruct the dynamic or their lags. The cool thing about that is if I have 10,000 variables and I can study the dynamics in 4 dimensions, I can pick any 4 of those variables and study it, which means I can put together the experiment I want. If I want to know the response of precipitation and temperature to MOI, Mediterranean Oscillation Index, I will put together an attractor with those as the variables. And you see in front of you that attractor. So I don't have the axes there, but it's in 3 space. It has the 2 arms that we saw in the scatter plots, upper arm there, a lower arm there. And this is just not a stationary picture. It shows the evolution of these 3 variables. And you can see how they evolve along this attractor in this video. So they are visiting the upper arm and then they cycle to the lower arm. Go to the upper arm, cycle to the lower arm. You'll see that the upper arm, it has, again, I label the points by months. It has the summer and early fall months in it. That's why I call them the dry months. The lower arm is visited during the winter and early spring months. These are the wet months. In A, I have the extreme lows in precipitation, temperature, and MOI indicated by the marks there. So typically in the extreme value literature, we define extreme lows as the lower 15 percentile of points. So here on this attractor, you have the green dots showing MOI in its lowest negative phase. And you have the red dot showing extreme low temperatures and the blue dot showing extreme low precipitation. And in B, we have extreme highs. So this is the upper percentile, 15 percentile in these. And this tells the resilience story, a beautiful resilience story. So MOI, that's an internal stressor. Remember, this is representing the global or the large scale atmospheric circulation patterns that are driving the local weather conditions, namely precipitation and temperature. When the MOI is in its extreme low phase, temperatures are in extreme low phase. This means cold. But precipitation over here is in an extreme high. This is showing that when MOI is at extreme low conditions, this system retains that wet, cold response. It does not change. The system is very resilient in this nonlinear dynamic. On the other hand, when the MOI is in its extreme positive phase, we have warm conditions. Temperatures, the red dots are at an extreme high. Precipitation is at an extreme low. So we have the dry, warm conditions. So what was hypothesized as the climatic driver of the watershed condition here, we've shown beautifully from the data, and we tell a resilience story that says, okay, even when we are at extreme phases of this climate index, the system maintains its behavior. And it does it endogenously, but not by going to a single point, but by oscillating along this attractor. Okay, I have one more thing to share with you, and then I'm finished. How can we use this for management? The World Meteorological Organization is very interested in an early warning resilience system. In other words, they want to know resilience conditions before they happen. And government can use this to predict system response, and so what they might have to do. So this is my version of an early warning system using the analysis that we just developed. Here you have the precipitation, temperature, and climate teleconnection plot. The blue line, that's the original data. So these are the data as I got them off the instruments. The dashed lines here, points above this are in the upper 15th percentile. So these are extreme points. Points below are in the lower 15th percentile of precipitation. The gray curves, that's the structural behavior of the system. That's the signal. So the gray, when it's above extreme value, you see the black points. Okay, the same logic with the temperature, the same logic with MOI. So above this dashed line, the MOI is an extreme positive phase, which could lead to extreme dry conditions in the watershed. Here below this dashed line, it's an extreme low phase. The purple area you see here, those are out of sample forecasts. Data we have not observed yet. I fed the attractor into a neural network machine learning algorithm, and it became a data robot. It learned the attractor dynamics, and the service it provided to me, it created new data. out of sample forecasts, things that haven't happened yet. So these are the curves you see in the purple. These were generated by a neural network. And I blow up the curves that you see there so you can see the forecasted resilience condition. So here, the black is forecasted precipitation, the red is forecasted temperature, the blue forecasted MOI index. You can see that the forecasted value in June of 2022, it was forecasted because when I did this work in January, this hadn't happened yet. But we had a peak in the positive phase of the MOI. It led to a peak in temperature. It led to a minimum in precipitation. Exactly the dry-warm resilience systemic response that we had modeled and that we now forecast. So we tell the Spanish government, this next year, we're going to see the same systemic response to extreme values we predict in the climate. So no worries. In other years, it might change that, and we'd be able to tell that to the managers. So thank you for your time and patience. I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Ray. You gave me some hope today. I started out as a modeler, and then I saw all the economists running after reduced form econometrics and RCTs. But now I see actually maybe there might be a new hype cycle coming up, and all of us look into models again, which would be great, actually. Are there any questions? Also in Zoom. Please.
Well, thank you for your very interesting and great speech. You're both modelers and you have dealt with internal dynamics and a lot. When it comes to resilience, especially when it comes to resilience, we have another problem which I might add to your thoughts, and that is that you deal with complex systems. These complex systems are managed by humans. And these humans, most of them are not modelers, even if the modelers are perfect. Those that manage the system have no idea how it functions. And that might add another problem, a problem of understanding. And through technological developments over the past decades, we have managed to almost perfectly linearize systems. And that adds to the misunderstanding or to the not understanding of the real world. If you are hungry, you need to eat something, you go to the supermarket and take something from the shelf and put it in the microwave. My goodness. Less than 2% of the population has any idea how food is produced because they don't know what food production is all about. We have also linearized technical systems, like our cars. In the 60s, my grandpa had a VW Beetle from 59 or so. That was a dynamic system. I drove that in the later 60s. And you step on the gas pedal and it moves somewhere. It's highly dynamic. You step on the brake, same thing happens. Today, our car do everything. They have stabilizing systems all over the place. And the modelers who created this technology, they knew what they were doing. But those that manage the technology have no idea anymore, and they need not have an idea anymore how the system functions. But this gap in the understanding how real world functions creates a lot of management problems, especially if it comes to political decisions. Would you agree on that?
Oh, yes.
So there's a nice book written by, who is this? Václav Spin. How the World Really Works, a Scientist's Guide to Our Past, Present, and Future. He elaborates this problem of deficit in understanding how the world functions.
I need to read that book. I need to get the title. You raised so many good points there. The first one is we don't understand the systems. And too many people who do this kind of empirical work, they brag that we're doing equation-free modeling. I find that so short-sighted because I go back to a statement by Clifford Stoll, who was a scientist who said, data is not information, is not theory. Data is not information. You have to analyze it. That's exactly what I'm doing here, diagnostic work. I started with data and I was able to generate a lot of information, but this is not where it stops. I am a modeler. I love modeling. I love the logic of modeling, but I don't want to model blindly. And so what information do I have now to understand what I'm modeling? I know the dynamics, or at least I have good evidence of the dynamics of the system. I do not model a system that automatically stabilizes, given that I found this nonlinear dynamic behavior. I model it using nonlinear equations, differential equations. The next step, information is not theory. The fun now is to look at these results and say, why did they happen? What processes are running these? What are the interrelationships? Well, I absolutely have to know that to model it. What type of functional responses do I need to model my explanations for why the data are behaving this way? So for me, this is all an exploratory exercise that then the information I can use to sit back and have some fun modeling. But it's not until that step where I can actually explain to a decision maker, here's the theory going on. Right now, I could just say, here's what the data tell us. Here's what we think is going on. But now is for the modelers to take this and model it in a way that corresponds to the real world, not just presuming what it should be like, but tailoring it to what we found empirically. So yes, I agree completely that we need to give managers an indication of the system they're actually managing. If we tell them to manage a system that really doesn't exist, they're going to be like Congress. They're going to be caught unaware and unable to respond in time to actually do something about a crisis. They're going to expect a system to stabilize when it doesn't.
Any other questions? Yes, please. I'd like to ask you the trust or the validity you put into your fourth graph. How do you judge it? How do you go about to show that it is correct?
Sure. Going back to this framework, that's where I build in the trust. Because I'm testing the hypotheses that need to be tested, and I'm using the best management techniques. And and to test those, I'm using strong statistical methods to test them that have been developed by the statisticians. And I don't interpret my results. I'm honest with the results. So if I don't find something, I'm not going to try and bend the analysis to get there. I want to take it where it goes. And so that's why you see all these branches if these tests tell me I have a stable system, that's what I'm going to model. And that's what I'm going to tell a manager. It's the same way that managers justify how they deal with water quality situations in an aquifer. They follow best management practices, and that's what I'm doing here. Can I make a mistake? Sure, because with all statistics, there is a threshold of false positives, and I'm trying to keep it at 5 out of 100. A significance level of 0.05. So that's my confidence level.
There was one back and then.
You showed a lot of these really nice frameworks for resilience. But I'm wondering, is there a way to really measure the resilience of a system, in a way you can with for example, I studied cybernetics, and there we had this concept of robustness, and it's kind of a really tangible mathematical thing. You can kind of calculate the robustness of the dynamic system in a way, but is there a way to do this with these interpretations of resilience also?
Yes, there is, but you need the right type of dynamic system to do it.
Okay.
And I'm not saying this is what you're suggesting, but everyone loves a good summary statistic, because you can look at one statistic and get information about the entire system. And when that summary statistic is informative, it's a great thing to have. But when the system dynamics are extremely complex, it's hard to capture it in one statistic or one index. You'll see several papers that attempt to capture the dynamic response of a system with a single measure. You can capture aspects of dynamic response with single measures, but to me, it's more informative not to try and go back to a single index, but to look at the information you have as a whole. But there are a lot of papers creating resilience indices, but my criticism of them is that you need a very simplistic dynamic response and to be able to capture everything that's going on in a single or even a couple of indices. Have you been working with systems where you were able to do that?
Not really. That's why I'm wondering. So you mean, for you, it's more like a qualitative.
Yes, I do the kind of analysis that you just saw. I look at the attractor, I look at the evolution of points on it, and I tell a story from that.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm not.
Yeah, Ray, data is crucial when you are looking at this kind of modeling, and you need long time series and reliable time series where measurement has remained the same over decades. Is that a reason why you are primarily working in the natural science arena? Because, I mean, participation data or temperature data we have for centuries, while maybe other more economic-oriented data we don't have and might be not as reliable?
That's a very perceptive question. And I could give a huge answer to it because it's kind of my life story, but I'll give a very short one. How did I get into this kind of work, and where am I now where I am? I was attending a math ecology modeling class, working from equations. And the professor, a friend of mine, said, "Hey, Ray, I want to show you something." He took me to his office and he said, "I can generate these plots from a single time series on one of these variables." Well, that would be pretty interesting. So he taught me how to do it. It took me 10 years to really figure out how to do it myself, and how to do it in a way that would be accepted in their literature. To answer your question, no, we don't do it in economics. And really, we don't do it in engineering all that much. I'm kind of on my own island here. I didn't invent these techniques. I've moderated them to my own use. They're invented by physicists, really mathematical physicists. But I have been one on the forefront interested in applying them to solve real world problems, because that's my interest. I don't want to just do data work. I want a question. I want to be excited when I get evidence that allows me to start to answer that question. In economics, I am so grateful for my training in agricultural economics, tremendous training in statistics and modeling and dynamics when I went to UC Davis. What I do, the reliability of it is applying these statistics I learned in econometrics and other places. But, and here's, I'll only take 30 more seconds. Why don't we use it more in economics? Because we have an anchoring bias, in my opinion, to self-adjusting markets. Demand equals supply. I don't see this in the data. I see a lot of volatility, and I see another option, which was introduced in the 1990s by a very good agricultural economist, Jean-Paul Chavez, Wisconsin, who said markets can be endogenously unstable. In other words, there can be internal frictions that cause demand not to ever equal supply. And I did a paper on this with Ernst, where we use this to explain the German hog cycle. And so I found out I was more interested in endogenous instability than stability that's excited by outside events, which to me, what is an outside event? It's something you don't want to model. And so in economics, we call climate random. It's not random to a climatologist. We call insect infestations random. It's not random to an entomologist. So I was interested in this system view. And why am I in an engineering department now? Because they don't care if I do food system economic work or I do watershed work, whereas my econ department would have said, oh, why are you doing hydrology? Why are you looking at algae blooms? So I guess I like the problem. I don't care which discipline it's in, I like the problem.
Thanks. We are a bit over time, but I still wanted to ask you one thing. And this is to comment on two aspects. One is system boundaries, and the other one is tipping points, which is sort of a buzzword that is coming up recently in this whole resilience debates. So you looked at MOI, temperature, and precipitation, and in a way you could argue that the MOI is an exogenous element to this. It's not, there are no feedbacks between local precipitation, temperature, and the MOI. Had you drawn the system boundaries a bit larger, would you have perhaps found tipping points in the system that you didn't detect because you looked at the smaller system? How would you deal? What would be your advice to someone studying a system? What rules would you apply, if there are any, to define where are my system boundaries? And how do I test for potentially existing tipping points that once you have a dynamic system with a stable factor, you can't model them even if they were there in the real world?
That's a really good question. It's the eternal question for modeling is, what are your boundaries? What do you consider external and internal? Complex systems, you can, when you model those and you have the nodes being each variable in the system and then the arrows between them, you don't have to have arrows going in both directions all the time. So MOI was part of my system, not external, but the attractor looked at the coevolution of MOI, temperature, and precipitation because I wanted to go off of this study that studied those three variables. And yes, I did find, which I say thankfully, that this large-scale climate teleconnection was an internal stressor of temperature and precipitation, and not the other way around, that local global conditions were affecting the atmosphere, although there are plenty of studies that talk about how precipitation that creates ground soil moisture, then evaporates back in to the atmosphere, becomes part of the convection process, and creates more rain. So if I did find arrows going back in the other direction, there could be an explanation. But the nice thing about nonlinear dynamics is you don't have to worry about the boundaries so much, because each variable has imprinted in it its interactions with the other. So even if I don't know what all the variables are, even if I don't have data on all of them, they're there when I use this delayed time embedding to construct the dynamics from even a single variable.
Thanks. Are there any other urgent questions to Ray? If not, thank you very much for your contribution. It inspired me a lot, and I think I'm going to think about what else I could do in the next few months. And looking forward to future discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.